G'day, I'm Peter Sheahan. I'm the founder and CEO of Carrikins Group, and with staff in 20-something cities and 7 countries, I kind of know firsthand the challenges of growing a business in a significantly disrupted environment. And really, the majority of keynotes that I deliver, and obviously you're in a selection process of some description, are designed to help the audience understand how to find opportunity in the change and disruption we face. But if I'm going to do that and create that kind of catalytic experience to really change their world, 3 things have to happen. Number 1, I need to do my research. This is the research brief for the speech you're about to watch. This is 300 plus pages of industry data, of benchmarking to really understand their world. Because how can I possibly help the audience find opportunity in change and disruption if I don't understand the change and disruption? 2, I have to select the right case studies and the right examples to move that audience to change the way they think, that are talking to the very points that their industry or the client, in this case, want them to understand. So being really intentional and customized in the content and the message. But 3, and just as important as content, by the way, is the emotional journey. Because if it was really just about content, you'd buy a book for $30 instead of investing in a keynote speaker. So this audience is a financial services audience. They're the highest performing agents in their distribution channel, and they are getting massively disrupted. The Department of Labor, the omni-channel world, and the role of technology in service delivery, transparency of fees, like big changes. And my objective, the clients specifically ask, the specific ask of me is to 1, have them see and find and believe there's opportunity in the change. And number 2, get them willing to commit to making the change. So that's the context of this presentation, and you should be thinking about that as it relates to your audience as well. But number 2, I'm going to stop at a couple of points along the way and help you understand why I chose a particular case study or what I'm trying to achieve, or why is the balance of the keynote so much of that content and not so much of that content, so you can understand the process. And again, the process would look different to your audience. This is for the financial services industry and this specific populace, but you'll get an understanding of how we would partner together if we were going to work on your event. So sit back, relax, enjoy the experience, and I'll see you on the other side. We want to help this group of unbelievably successful people find opportunities for even greater success in spite of the change and disruption that we face. So I spent most of the time preparing for today, trying to get my head around what kind of change are you actually facing, what kind of disruption is ultimately out there. And I began at the macroeconomic level, and obviously we've got all sorts of volatility in the environment and a low interest rate environment, which really doesn't help on some parts and some sides of the business. So that was a pretty obvious kind of exploration. I then moved from there to demographics. You know the story about demographics as it relates to the workforce. The agent population has a very mature average age when relative to the country, and the biggest challenge we've got is only about 2% of millennials are even thinking about a career in insurance, so we have some real challenges around the workforce issues there. But on the flip side of that, and I think Peter did a pretty good job pointing this out, is that we have less than 5% penetration with long-term care. Life insurance has been actually flat for about 30, 35 years in this country. So the aging population represents a huge market opportunity if we're willing to diversify into that space. So that kind of wrapped up the demographic piece. And I thought, well, let's take a look at legislation. Lost 7 days of my life trying to understand the Department of Labor, after which I thought I might stab myself with a pencil. Got through that experience and thought, well, there's a little bit of change and disruption going on there. I thought, let's take a look at the industry. No secret to you, mass commoditization, particularly in personal lines, margin compression, making changes both at level, but also the way we go to market and the way we compete in that environment. And yet there's still not an absence of competition in spite of that compression, because the low interest rate environment is forcing big money and big capital to look for better returns. And this is one of the industries that you're starting to see consolidation and roll-ups. That's leading to a change in the way big organizations go to market in the channel. You heard Amy talk a little bit about that in your own conversations here. And then you add technology to that and what it's doing in terms of the direct model for the consumer. But on top of that, it's also creating whole new market opportunities related to cyber and everything that's sitting around that, as well as shifts in duty of care. So there's a lot happening at an industry level, some of it really challenging, some of it actually really exciting. So if you move from that and then go to the member, the customer, the consumer, him or herself, number 1, transparency and accountability. I mean, people can't go to the toilet anymore without telling 7 of their friends. So don't think that they're not going to talk about their experience with you as that relates. We've got viral expectations as we get increasingly more product categories and solutions delivered to us in omni-channel and seamless ways. Members will take those expectations and they'll put them on you and your agency and the broader value chain in terms of how they're going to be treated and what they want that to look like. And then finally, they want sort of fully customized solutions just for them because they're getting that everywhere else. Why shouldn't they get it from you? Anyway, so I went through the macro stuff, I went through the industry stuff, took a look at the member experience overall, and I settled on one clear conclusion. You all are going through just a little bit of change. Would that be a reasonable statement? I know you're like, dude, really? They brought you to Montreal to say that? Actually, yes. So we're less than 5 minutes into this presentation, and I've basically just unpacked for them the macro, the industry, and the consumer and member level change they face. Now remember, my brief for this presentation is not to help them understand how their world is changing. Trust me, they feel the pain. My job is to catalyze them to begin to do something intelligent, constructive, and value creating in response. But in order to sort of create that emotional engagement, to create that intensity, I need to ground them in their pain. But I don't want to spend too long there. So the reason we open up like that, it's rapid fire and quite in their face, is to ground them in the pain, ground them in the change they're facing so I can now move the conversation into what to do about it. Now, it seems like such a short, simple part of the presentation. I have like a 300-page briefing document that I needed to read and understand and consume and synthesize in order to open it up like that. Let me tell you the outcome for the audience from that experience. They are under 5 minutes in and they're like, number one, this guy understands our world. Number two, wow, our world, there's some pain in our world right now. Three, gosh, I hope he's going to give us an answer. He understands it, but can he help us do something about it? And that's really the goal of hitting them so hard so early with that content. I know you spoke yesterday with Edie about really big picture changes and what 10, 20, 30 years might look like. I have zero interest in dissecting these changes in any more detail than you've already done. I think you know what's happening. You don't need someone from the outside to come and remind you. I think a much more fruitful conversation is, what do you do about that stuff? As a firm, my company, Carrikins Group, we do about 40,000 workshops a year for about 1.2 million people, all of them going through change, all of them being disrupted. So that's a pretty good sample size when it comes to looking at the data and how people respond. And can I tell you, in all the work we do all over the world, we have only ever met 3 responses. We've only ever seen 3 responses to this kind of change, this kind of disruption. Response number 1, lay in the corner in the fetal position, sucking your thumb whilst making small mewing sounds and hoping it all just goes away. Anyone familiar with this behavior? Yeah, right? Like, in fact, some of you did that this morning, but that was more related to the wine you had last night than it may be the external market conditions. But can I tell you seriously, I would define certain public sector boards as responding to disruption right now in exactly that way. I don't think you're in the top 5 to 8% of agents and you behave like that. So I'm going to work under the hallucination that whilst we all engage in those behaviors at times, that none of you live there. Yeah? Let me tell you, actually, a significant percentage of this agency population are in that box. The average age of an agent within this distribution network is late 50s compared to the average or the median age of the population they're trying to serve, which is actually in the late 30s, right? And the major challenge the company, my client, has with their distribution channel is that they're not responding to the change because many of them are towards the end of their life, really. Not the end of their life, the end of their professional life, let's be fair, right? And so what I'm doing here is using what's called social identity theory. I'm trying to have them reject an identity, even if it's one that could relate to their behavior, to begin to have them associate themselves with a more constructive or a more proactive identity. And you'll see me unpack that now. But I just want you to know I'm playing with them a little bit here. They know I'm being a little bit facetious. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek. Second response is what we call the passive-aggressive response. It's when we come to the celebration here in Montreal and we all nod our head in all the sessions and we're like, yeah, there's so much changing and so much going on. And then we go back to work and we do everything exactly the same way we did it before we got here. Anyone familiar with that behavior? Not an unreasonable behavior, by the way, but certainly a challenge. I'm going to come back to visit that in a second. Because the third response is, wow, the world's changing, so must I. Quick question. Is responding to change enough, however? Is it possible that as an entrepreneur, as a business leader, as each and every one of you are, is it possible to respond to change and create more damage and destroy more value through your response than you would have if you'd otherwise done nothing. Is that possible, yes or no? Absolutely. In fact, it's the majority of responses usually destroy value. I mean, I've never met a business leader, an entrepreneur who tried to alienate customers, frustrate staff, and destroy value, but I've met plenty that do it all the time. And it's often because of the way they choose to respond. So I'm going to work under an assumption that the vast majority of you are going to see what's happening and do something about it. But I want to make sure what you do about it is value creating, is differentiating for you and how you go to market. But just before I do, I want to just stop in this second bucket for a second. Some of you have been at this for 20, 30, sometimes even more years than that. Each of you are obviously independently successful and most likely independently wealthy as well as a result of what you've done. You could be forgiven for saying, you know what, I'm good, I'm just going to ride this one out. I can deal with the margin compression. Life will be just fine for me, thanks. But I would like to remind you of, one, what it felt like when you first got started in this business, when you were pedal to the metal and you were on that kind of entrepreneurial journey. And I want to ask you to consider how exciting adapting might actually be. Let me explain. Very first time I ever came to Canada, I was in the Toronto Convention Centre, and every now and then in my job, you get to meet someone you have absolutely no right to meet. Just before you listen to this story, this is such a critical idea for this audience. Might not say that in any audience ever again for the rest of my life, right? But this is the top 5%, essentially, top 5 to 8% of agents in one of the highest performing financial services organizations on the planet. These people are independently wealthy, many of them very mature, as I've already pointed out. They really don't have to change. They'll be able to ride off into the sunset even if their margins get squeezed and their book value drops. That's all right for them. That's not very good for my client whose entire business depends on the quality of their distribution channel. So I'm being particularly sensitive to and investing significant time in recognizing that they have a choice, recognizing that it's not innovate or die or change or die for them, because it's really not. And I want them to go, okay, I see that we don't have to, but now I want to create what I would call a burning ambition. So the first 3 or 4 minutes, stating the pain, talking about what we'd call a burning platform, like something's really happening in this industry. But that's not going to be enough to get them to change, because it's not burning so fast that they're not going to survive, right? So now I'm reversing the psychology and going, not only have you got the burning platform, but what an unbelievable opportunity. Like, remember when you first got started, the power of being an entrepreneur, of adapting to a uncertain, volatile, changing environment. And so I'm now going to double down on a story that I hope appeals to that identity, them as a successful entrepreneur, and have them start to identify and be aware of how critical it is to not only be good at what you do, but reinvent no matter how good you already are. And that's really where we're going to go with this conversation. May not do that in another audience ever again in my life, but for this audience, they needed this conversation. And on this day, I met a guy called Garry Kasparov. Do you guys know who Garry Kasparov is? Played chess, was good, right? In fact, won 16 world championships, unbelievable success story. And I'm like, I'm about to meet this guy. What questions should I ask him? Because I always like to dig deep and find out what drives these kind of people. And I asked Garry Kasparov in Toronto, I said, of all the world championships you won, which was the hardest one to win? I actually said something else, by the way. I said, I know everyone thinks you're famous for winning 16 world championships. I don't think that's your greatest achievement. I think your greatest achievement was challenging Vladimir Putin in the Russians' elections and not dying. I mean, that's an impressive kind of feat, right? He didn't think that was very funny, by the way. But I then went on to my actual question, which was of the 16 you won, which was the most difficult to win? And I thought he would say the first or the last. And he said, no, actually the third was the hardest one to win. And I was like, that's a strange question. I said, why the third? He said, here's what happened. He said, I came out of nowhere. I was like young. I played aggressive. I was like 22 years old. I was 12 games to 10. No one knew what hit them. And I sort of wanted to joke, you know what, you play chess aggressive? What does that mean? Like you moved your pawns really quickly? I'm not quite sure what that... But after the first joke didn't go very well, I thought I'd keep that one to myself. He's really big, by the way, like really big. Anyway, so he says, I played really aggressive, played fast, I won 12 games to 10, no one knew what hit him. He said, I came back year 2, and he said, I won again with exactly the same strategy I won year 1 with. And he said, the problem was when I came back for year 3, I knew everyone knew I was coming. I knew they'd spent the last 12 months dissecting my game. And then in order to win the third time, I didn't just have to learn a whole new way of playing. You've kind of heard this cliche before. But I had to unlearn an old way of playing as well. And he said that was much more difficult than learning a new way of playing. But he said even that wasn't the most difficult thing. He said the hardest thing was when I was in a game and I thought I might lose. He said I would feel this deep physical distress. Like I would feel a physical pull back to playing in the way I had historically had success out of fear that the new way wasn't working. And he said what I came to understand in my third year is that in order to be great and stay great, you have to be capable of escaping the gravity of your own success. And as I thought about this group of people, like the top 5, top 8% of performers across one of the most respected brands in the industry, I get that, you guys are unbelievably successful. You're my kind of people, entrepreneurs going at yourself. Some of you well and truly could finish the game right now and ride out on top. But I would put it to you that, in fact, what made you this good and what got you to this level was not only the entrepreneurial energy and willingness to take risk, but it was the willingness to let go sometimes of even the things that underpinned and were foundational to your success to relearn a new strategy and go to the next level. And I've never met anyone who retired and was wishing they had less to do. Most people actually get there and they go, I want more to do. I want to be re-engaged. I want to be relevant. I want to be important. I want to put it to you that even those of you that could easily ride this change out, that in fact you would be bored outside of your mind if you did, and that in fact all you've ever known is how to reinvent yourself and adapt and change, or unlearn and relearn and escape the gravity of that success. So whether you're in this bucket because you just don't want to change and you think you're brilliant, or if you're in this bucket because you don't need to change and you are, I would just provoke you to consider being in the third bucket and consider adapting one more time. Because who knows what's around the corner, what life comes at you fast. I think Bill was at the campaign, right? But 2, because it's actually who you are as a person. So you might notice I'm being pretty gentle with this group right now. Like I can be provocative and pretty in your face, and I started fairly assertively with this group, but now I'm really talking about them and their life, and I want to give them a bit of credit. This is the top performing agents. These guys have created unbelievable success and wealth for themselves and probably don't have to change right now. We want them to change because that's what's good for my client. And so I'm just acknowledging where they're at, and I'm trying to be sensitive to the fact that if I showed up there with that kind of cliche, change or die or innovate or die, they could sit back and go, you know what, sunshine, we're going to be just fine. So I've hit them hard early, created a bit of a burning platform. I've talked about the importance of not waiting for a burning platform though, and starting to change early, acknowledging that that's scary because you start risking all the things you've set your life up for and worked for to this stage in your life, but then saying, why don't you just consider this? And so I'm gently bringing them into this third bucket, which is the world's changing and I better do something about it. But let's go to this focus, let's go to this conversation. Let's make sure we're in the 30% of responders that creates value in response to the change. We did a project for a client probably about 7 or 8 years ago, maybe even 9 years ago now, called News Corporation. You guys know News Corp, right? They owned it. At the time, they just bought Dow Jones, the Wall Street Journal. They owned 21st Century Fox, Fox News, etc. And Murdoch was struggling with massive change. The problem was they used to make their money controlling the distribution of video, print, audio content, and they'd monetize the points at which they had control. Then the internet came along and let people download what they like, whenever they like, on whatever device they like. And their business model was under massive threat. Anyway, we got hired, and they asked us, it was such an interesting project, they asked us to go back in time and study organizations who had been disrupted in similar ways, but had actually found more opportunity on the other side as a result of the change. But specifically, they asked us to look at what was the difference between the decisions made by those that created value and the decisions made by those that didn't. And we went back. We didn't just study companies. We studied societies. We studied not-for-profits. We studied anything we could get our hands on. One of them was we studied the city of London in 1901. In 1901, turns out the mayor of London, a guy called Joe Dimsdale, put together in a room, not dissimilar to this, the smartest people that he could find on the planet. They were trying to build a strategic plan for 1925. Quick question. Who'd like a 25-year planning horizon. Would that be right? Yeah. Anyway, 25-year planning horizon. The disruption he was facing was population growth. It was exploding in London. So he's like, my city's exploding at the seams. People just keep moving en masse to the city. Birth rates are high. How am I going to get this city ready for 1925? And after 3 days, they settled on 3 key issues that they thought the city would need to be ready for to be successful in response to the disruptive force of population growth. Quick question. What priorities, what 3 things do you think made their list? Like if you were the mayor, you ran London, it was 1901, what do you think would have been on your mind? By the way, this is the bit where you get to be allowed. Did you say insurance? In fact, transportation was number 1. They estimated that based on population growth, they would need 1 million new horses to get people around. Seriously, that was in their plan. Now, if you have 1 million new horses getting around, you've got a whole lot of other problems that you now have to deal with. Hygiene was number 2. How do you keep the streets clean and disease-free? Third issue you probably wouldn't guess was property prices. How do you house that many animals close enough to the city that people have access to them, but not so close? They take up all the available land, supply and demand gets out of whack, no one can afford to live in London anymore. Quick question. How relevant was their strategic response to change come, say, 1905? So, tiny bit of interaction here, right? Not just like me getting that gentleman or a couple of people to yell out, but now I'm forcing them to put themselves in these former scenarios of change and disruption. I'm going all the way back to 1901 because it's non-threatening. But I'm slowly going to bring this conversation forward so they can begin to acknowledge one thing, that most people who went through massive change and disruption deluded themselves about how significant that impact was going to be on their business. Because whilst I just was quite gentle with them and acknowledging maybe they don't have to change, the truth is the impact of the omni-channel world, the impact of the fiduciary standard, the demand for fee and commission transparency in their industry is coming very, very quickly. And I would actually put to you that the change is going to be more severe than they're probably willing to admit. And so what I'm now trying to do is take them on a gentle and then slowly more confronting journey to say, maybe I don't know everything, meaning them. Maybe my answer to what's happening and my belief that I don't really need to do anything about it could in fact be flawed logic, as you'll discover, a very bad assumption. And so I start all the way back in 1901. It's a fun and interesting story. I can get some interaction happening, force them to get involved, but it's also non-threatening. It gets more confronting and threatening as we move forward. We studied here in North America, we studied the telecommunications industry. We looked at AT&T. I don't know if you know this, but in 1990, AT&T hired McKinsey, because nobody gets fired for hiring McKinsey, and paid them an inordinate amount of money to do a market feasibility study on the opportunity cell phones represented. That was a pretty big disruption. Would that be a fair statement? And so they studied it. McKinsey, millions of dollars went into this report. McKinsey published a thing. Here was the question. If AT&T was to sell 100% of phones in 100% of the world's markets for the next decade, how many cell phones might they sell? What was the total market opportunity? And McKinsey come back with their report in 1990, and it is 900,000 cell phones. This room probably used 900,000 cell phones in that period. In fact, do you want to know how many shipped in the 10 years that followed? 900 million shipped. Park that. I could give you 100 of these examples, but let me just wrap up here. We were asked to present the findings. Now remember, here was our brief. Tell us the difference between good decisions and bad decisions during times of change, ones that make money and ones that don't make money. And we're asked to present this at the Global Subscription Television and Radio Industry Conference. So people like Murdoch and all of his counterparts, 350 CEOs running media companies around the world. I'm the second speaker. The first speaker is a Texan man. He was the CEO at the time of the largest satellite TV company on Earth. He gets up, this is in mid-2008, he says to 349 of his peers who are all in the business of controlling access to content. He says, quote, I cannot see a time in the next decade when broadband speeds will be fast enough to threaten the distribution of video content. Unquote. And I'm about to do a speech about how executives do stupid things in the face of change. So I basically just get up and I'm like, dude, seriously? I actually didn't say that. I got up and said, that's a really interesting perspective, which turned out to be a very smart thing to say because he then became the COO of News Corp, and that would have been a very uncomfortable conversation for us to have. Let's say our renewal meeting wouldn't have gone quite as well, right? But I did get up. While he was giving his speech, I emailed one of our clients that owns a website called YouTube. You might have heard of it before. And I asked my client, I said, tell me, how many downloads have taken place in the last month on YouTube? 2 billion was the answer. Now, just cats doing stupid things, but there's still 2 billion of them, right? That's enough, yeah? And so just don't get caught in the story, get caught in the learning, all right? While a business leader in a position just like yours, running his own organization, in this case a little larger than ours, but it's no different, is saying he doesn't see this externality as a threat, video-based distribution on the internet. Well, he says that's not a threat. 2 billion downloads have taken place in that space. Would it be fair to say there's enough evidence in the 2 billion to suggest where the future might go? Would that be fair to say? Is there enough evidence there? Were there cell phones in the late 80s, early 90s when McKinsey did their study? Were there already cell phones, yes or no? Yeah, I mean, they're as big as this podium and you had to wheel them around, right? But people had them. I mean, the bricks, people used to carry them, you know? They were there. Were there cars, or as you would say cars, in 1901 when London did its report, when Dimsdale did his study? Were there cars, yes or no? 78,000 of them already on the road. Did you know the first city in the world to build a multi-story parking garage was London, England? They did it in 1906, 6 years after estimating they'd need 1 million new horses to get their population around. So just before I unpack what you really learn when you do this, I want you to just reflect on what's happened. I've taken them through 3 very kind of simple but quite engaging stories about how throughout history, from all the way back 100 plus years ago to quite recently, executives, people just like them, make really bad assumptions, quite stupid sort of decisions really about the world and the things that are surrounding them, like the horses and the phones and the speed of the internet. That would never impact our industry. And they're all nodding and almost laughing at sort of the insanity of some of those decisions. But that's the perfect setup because now they're like, gosh, how could you be that silly? And now we're going to talk specifically about them and their changes. So I could have gone straight to them and their changes, but would never have the same impact as them going, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. Maybe we're doing exactly the same thing, which is what I need because I'm trying to get them to embrace change that they don't necessarily believe they need to worry about. When you get to do the work we get to do, when you get to study people who are dealing with exactly what you're dealing with right now, you learn 2 really interesting things. 1, nothing ever changes an industry that nobody predicted or that hadn't been on the periphery of that industry for years before actually gaining critical mass and changing the way business gets done. You think about the stuff that we're worried about right now. Enhanced fiduciary responsibility, irrespective of the legal implications of that word, but putting clients at the center of everything we do. Is that a new idea, yes or no? 2, increasing transparency so people understand who and how we get paid. Is that a brand new? No. In fact, those 2 things have happened in this country, the UK, Australia, in fact, most of the Western world. I mean, we all knew, it's been sitting and talked about for years, the notion of the internet as a direct-to-consumer model. That's not a brand new idea. You know, in the UK, it took 10 years to go from 0% penetration to more than 90% penetration of direct-to-consumer. But it sat on the periphery of the industry for a decade before it even moved the needle. So now they're uncomfortable again, which is exactly where I want them. I'm trying to disturb their view of the world. I'm trying to disrupt the way they think about the very things that are disrupting them, right? And so I took them gently through these non-related examples, and we're all laughing at the silly decisions these people make. And then I list 4 things that are compressing their margin and stealing market share from them in this moment on this day. At this point, they're primed. I could tell them exactly what to do, and they're going to absorb it. They're going to be into it. So that was an important setup to get them ready and open to the next set of observations that are going to follow, which is how do you actually lead and drive the transformation? Nothing ever changes an industry that wasn't already right in front of you. So if you want to know what your industry is going to look like in 10 years, you don't need ED and 4D printing. You need to look at exactly what's happening right now that's not really hurting us, but it's sitting out there on the edges and we're worried about it and we're talking about it, and understand that that's the thing most likely to make the change. 2, change is actually really slow until it's not. What you notice is that these things just take ages to get momentum, but when they get it, they move fast. And so on April 1, we're all going to be like, oh my gosh, right? Thankfully, I haven't been doing that. But in fact, I have clients that have been doing, just like for 5-6 years, have been getting ready for what the likely interpretation of this would be, or at least how Dodd-Frank was going to play out when compliance got figured out, right? So this would look completely different for your industry. You probably didn't even know what half of that language meant or what those forces of change were. But for them, this is real. This is what the 350 pages allows me to do, is create all these nested loops inside of the presentation. Like, don't wait for a burning platform, but I'm going to make you feel like you're in one. Understand you've got to escape the gravity of success, and that actually being great and staying great is about changing before you need to. I know you don't need to because your business is really successful, and wow, aren't you so amazing? My gosh, look how stupid some executives should be. Maybe we're going to be those executives, right? So you can see how there's like these nested loops in there, but every single time I come back and land it in their world with their data, their stats, their changes. Because that's the bit that makes it real. That's the bit that makes it personal. So here's my challenge to you. My challenge to you is the change and the opportunity, let's reframe it. The opportunity that you face is likely hidden in plain sight right in front of you right now. And it's just the way you're thinking about it and your business and how it should or shouldn't get done that's either opening your mind to that possibility or closing your mind to that possibility. Because in our experience, the single most critical thing to get right when facing disruption is the assumptions you make about the disruption itself and the need for you to change. And if I was to reframe that, I think Bill pointed it out when he talked about Mr. Lincoln himself, saying that, bring solutions that no one else can bring, and number 2, question assumptions and be prepared to adapt. Edie talked about it yesterday when she talked about, educated incapacity. Is that the right language? I apologize, I wasn't here in the room, but this is an idea that we get blinded to stuff. So what I'm trying to do now is pull through the themes from the other speakers to say that, hey, you've been hearing this over and over. This is true. This is not, they weren't wrong when they talked about questioning assumptions. The futurist, Edie, who was on the day before, wasn't wrong when she talked about the fact that we think we're too smart, and it's in fact not what we don't know that gets us into trouble, but it's what we think we know that just ain't so, which is, by the way, a Mark Twain line. But I'm trying to pull that through to almost create third-party evidence, third-party credibility for the point I'm about to land, which is what you believe about change and what you believe about your need to change is almost more important than the tactics and strategies. And so I'm not the only speaker that's probably landing this point, so I want to pull that through for the whole conference. So I said to you I wanted to help you understand how to navigate the change and disruption in a way that's profitable. Well, the very first step to getting that right is to be willing to question your assumptions, the very things you think you know. I'm going to go way deeper on this, by the way, and give you examples of where I think you should be questioning them. The second thing you need to do, and we'll unpack this as well, is you need to get, knowing what that change is, using future-focused assumptions, you need to get really clear on how you intend to win and compete in the marketplace. Like, what is your actual differentiated value proposition? Because if you are in an agency model and you're not adding value in the value chain, you will get disintermediated, period. It happens in every industry, in every country on earth. We will not be an exception. We have to understand the value we bring and how we win. And then every dollar we spend and every hour we invest has to be lined up to that value proposition, and you ignore the distractions. 3, that means you've got to take some risk. Small, controlled risks. You don't bet the farm on this stuff, but not having to bet the farm depends on responding to change sooner. Does that make sense? You'll start to see these things linked together. And then 4th and finally, again, Murray Lincoln said the same thing. Collaboration. Transformation doesn't happen in isolation. It happens together. So before we start unpacking the case studies and examples, I want to explain two things to you. Number one, there's actually 7 or 8 critical things an organization and an individual and entrepreneur needs to understand to successfully navigate change. In an hour and 5 minutes, you can't do 7 or 8. So I've picked the 4 that are most critical to this audience based on the objectives set by my clients. So for example, collaboration is in there because one of the visions of their current CEO is this concept called one company, and I won't say the name of the business, but his whole idea is that there is a closer relationship and greater collaboration between the agents and between agents and head office, right? So that's why I may have chosen that at a structure level. However, where the real magic happens, and the reason we do all this research, is because I want to choose case studies and examples to illustrate assumptions, for instance, that are actually assumptions that they're at risk of making. So I'm going to unpack a case study and then I'm going to land it in where I think they are at risk of making the same mistake. Or when it comes to clarity and alignment, you heard me talk about agencies and disintermediation. That's a real issue for them, might not be for you. And so the case study I choose for clarity and alignment is designed to make that point based on what they're going through. And I can't do that unless we get this kind of information and get this kind of understanding first. So deliberately, intentionally chosen structure based on the objective of the client, and then deliberately chosen case studies based on what we've learned about the likely risks that exist inside their industry as it relates to their response to change. We have to question the things we think we know. A better conversation is how. What is the thing we need to understand as business leaders to make sure we don't get anchored into educated incapacity? Educated incapacity is not my concept, it's not my term. That was Edie, who was the keynote on day 1. So this is the closing keynote, that was the opening keynote. I've not met her, don't know her work, but it became a big theme when I got there. I interviewed some of the audience, found out what they remembered. So I've now inserted that concept and gave it reference a little while ago, so I'm not claiming her intellectual property, into my speech so the audience feels like this whole conference is a seamless experience. Number 1 is focus on the outcome of what you sell rather than the inputs you use to sell it. I'll explain. We have a client who's a defense contractor. They hire spies, basically. So they literally hire spies, send them into war zones, gather intelligence, infiltrate local networks, feed that information back to Langley, and they get a cost-plus model. So if it costs them $100,000 to send that person off for a year, they'll charge $107,000. That's the margin, and everyone kind of goes on, and the scale is perfectly linear in their business model. Anyway, their CEO went to a TED conference. You guys know the TED conferences, little 20-minute videos that everyone watches. Anyway, she went to the actual conference in Monterey and was so inspired, came back and went, we need a TED conference here in the company. And launches this big TED effort where every sort of quarter they would bring 2 dozen people in, they'd provoke everyone, and then they would leave. Anyway, I was invited one day, and on the day I spoke, there was this other guy that spoke. By the way, people sometimes say I look young. This guy looked like he was about 11, okay? And let me give you a sense. There's 60 people in the room, including the board of the company, of which 2 members of the board were former members of the Joint Chiefs. I mean, this is a serious, experienced, seasoned military crowd. And this little kid gets up with skinny jeans and sneakers and just totally disses the audience right now. By the way, he wasn't 11, he was 26. He has a double degree and a PhD in unstructured data and analytics from MIT. He's like Doogie Howser of the next generation, right? And he gets up, he has 20 minutes, and he says to 65 of the most powerful military professionals on earth, quote, this is mid-2009, quote, I believe social media will have far-reaching geopolitical and national security impacts within the next decade, unquote. There's silence in the room. He says it again, he says, I believe social media will have far-reaching geopolitical and national security impacts in the next 10 years. This gentleman at the back, who you have seen on television, by the way, at the back, says, do you mean things like twit face and stuff? Couldn't make this up, right? And Doogie's like, do you mean Twitter and Facebook? And he's like, yeah, that's stuff my grandkids play. He's like, do you think that's going to have national security impacts? And he laughs at the kid. And the guy's like, yeah, I fundamentally think it will. They proceeded to question him. They began to question his credibility, as though having a PhD in math from MIT doesn't cut it anymore, right? And off he goes, and they laugh their way off. But there were 3 people in the room who thought there was something in it and went and conducted a little bit of work on their own and thought that maybe there is a way that you could scrape the World Wide Web for unstructured data, tweets and stuff like that, and begin to run pattern recognition, just like an Amazon engine would do in an e-commerce platform, but do it with information and data, and then look for patterns and exceptions to those patterns, and feed that information back to Langley. Maybe we would be able to find different, if not better, intelligence. And in fact, turns out you can. You can find better intelligence for less money without sending people into war zones to get it. They pitched that idea to their senior execs, including the twit-face guy. And they responded with, listen to this. We don't want anything to do with that. We are not in the software business. We're in the spy business. And in that moment, they wedded themselves to a set of assumptions that completely blinded them of the market opportunity, because neither are they in the software or the spy business. They're in the intelligence business. And if you be honest with yourself and reflect, when a new model emerges to solve the end consumer, the member problem, that's more effective, easy to interact with, easy to engage with, when a new model emerges, it wins 6 days a week and twice on a Sunday, even if sometimes it takes a little while to catch up. Just ask Uber and the taxi companies right now. So that might seem like a very innocuous line to you. That was extremely provocative, what I just said. Their struggle right now is direct-to-consumer models, and their struggle right now is non-traditional competitors coming into their industry. And what they're trying to do is use legislation to protect themselves from competition, and they're trying to deny the advancement of technology as a means of distributing financial services products. And in essence, falling prey to exactly the same challenge that the defense contractor fell. So that case study is so intentional for them. And now I'm about to go deliberately into the very legislation that they're facing. So this next case study, I probably will never tell in any audience other than a financial services audience, but I would never tell it first. Like putting this there has them begin to go, wow, maybe we're defining ourselves by our inputs, not our outputs. We need to be outcome focused. Is this really about us? Or is this about the member, the investor? And the truth is, as an industry collectively, they're protecting themselves at the expense of the investor, the customer, the consumer, the member. And I wanted to make that pretty clear that that's what's happening. And now I'm going to move into the very legislation that's driving that process for this industry. Now, interestingly, go back to my first observations. Anyone know how old Uber is as a company? Turns 11 in October. You've probably known it for 2 to 3 years, because change is really slow until it's not. By the way, the entire intelligence community has pivoted towards software and analytics and unstructured data, but this company missed a massive market opportunity because they allowed their conditioned bias, their educated incapacity, to define who they were by the input and the process rather than by the outcome. The value chain is irrelevant when a new way to create the value emerges. Or to put it differently, people who have grown up to be really good with a hammer tend to think every new opportunity is a nail. And they try and shoehorn the new future into the old go-to-market model, when what they really need to do is evolve the model. So my challenge to you as entrepreneurs, as leaders, as business owners, is anchor around the outcome you create and be willing to change out and adapt to the input and the process if and as new and more impactful models for value creation start to emerge. That will be number one. The second thing is kind of a little more, we'll hit a little closer to home for you guys. Does anyone know who those two gentlemen are on the left? This will be the most boring part of the presentation for you as a third party, but those two gentlemen in the slide, forget Michael Porter, who's an academic on the right, are the congressman and senator, I think, I'm not sure actually where they sit in the House, who are driving the legislation that is pulling the rug out from under this group. So when I put that up there, I can assure you they're paying more attention now than probably at any other point, even if the case is probably less relevant to you. But this is like their world. That's Messrs. Dodd and Frank, right? Obviously, they've been on your dartboard for a little while. I understand this, right? Anyone know who the guy is on the right? It's a guy called Michael Porter. Michael Porter is the single most cited business academic in history. He's believed to be one of the top 5 management gurus like ever, right? And he got famous with a thing called the Porter hypothesis. He did a study in the early I think the study started in the 70s, but he really drove it deep in the 80s. He studied the industrial manufacturing firms following the EPA legislation that fundamentally changed the way they engaged in process and the restrictions around pollution and runoff. I mean, I would put to you that what Dodd-Frank represents to you is nowhere near as disruptive as what the EPA legislation represented to these groups. I mean, this is massive transformation. Trust me, environmental legislation is not my sweet spot. It's also not something that I think is particularly interesting. However, it's the same sort of scale of government intervention in an industry is happening in financial services right now. So these kind of examples are extremely related to this audience. May not be relevant for yours, but really relevant for these people, which is why we do the research to pick the right examples. And he studied the firms who were the quote-unquote most compliant, meaning they were most aggressive in their response and most willing to invest in going above and beyond what the requirement was as it related to reducing waste and protecting the environment. And he studied their market performance compared to their peers. And here's what he found, that the more aggressive the response was to the regulation and the legislation, the more profitable the firm was in the decade that followed. Because by virtue of leaning into the disruption, leaning into the change, leaning into the requirements, they found opportunities in their business for efficiency and innovation and, in fact, revenue that they didn't realize they would find. So, for instance, some of them make more margin selling the waste of their core product than the margin they make selling the core product itself. Isn't that mind-blowing, right? And I would like to provoke, this is a bit, by the way, where I make sure I never get invited back, okay? So, I would like to provoke you to look at the DOL and everything related to Dodd-Frank in a really similar capacity. Because, and I want to say that for 3 reasons. Reason number 1 is, if you get to the core of what the requirement is, it says, number 1, do your research before you make a recommendation. And number 2, make sure that recommendation is really good for the member. We shouldn't actually need to legislate for that, by the way. And I think it was Peter or Bill that pointed out on stage this morning, if you're in this room, it was Peter talked about, if you're in this room, you're already brilliant at this stuff, right? Like you are likely already compliant, for the record. That's number 1. The second reason is, this has happened before in other parts of the world, okay? Including where I'm from. And I remember going through the whole experience. Would you mind if I shared with you what the outcomes were in terms of this go-to-market? And now, I need to just back out. It was as impactful on the financial advice space as it was on the agent space. So I get that we sort of sit in different parts of this kind of industry. But here are basically what we learned from the international reality. Number 1, everyone believed 2 things. Number 1, that the fiduciary standard, and it wasn't quite called that in Australia necessarily, but this idea of best interest, everyone thought that was going to destroy the market. Like they really thought this was Armageddon and the beginning of the end. And 2, they believed the simultaneous emergence of technology would commoditize everything that they did. Neither turned out to be true, by the way. There were 4 or 5 things that happened. All right, we're about to get into a very deep and complex and content-heavy part of the presentation. I'm actually not going to let you watch the whole thing because it's about time and effort and utilization in professional services business. It's about international environments where identical legislation is happening in America has transformed financial services industry, their world. We're going to talk about how people won in those environments. So it's detailed and really industry specific. Now, you would probably find that pretty taxing and quite boring. This is the bit they're almost the most engaged in from the whole presentation because I'm taking this abstract worldview and I'm driving it deep into their business. We're literally going to talk about their operating model and how they go to market. What I am going to do is, before I skip to the next case study supporting this assumptions idea though, I just want to show you, 20 seconds of me amongst the crowd and having the conversation. Because if you're going to go deep into content like this, then being amongst them so they feel like you're kind of part of them and part of their industry and part of their world, number one. And number two, just the stimulation of me moving around amongst them is important to keep this as an engaging piece. So I'll show you a little bit of that footage, but then I'm going to skip to another case study, which is going to be very light and airy and not as content and substantive as most of my stuff, but that's really intentional because even though you haven't had to watch it, there's probably 8 minutes of deep industry knowledge and deep industry information that they're going to have sat through before I bring them out energetically out the other end. In the UK, the number of agents dropped. In Australia, they didn't at all, actually. So in some countries, there was some consolidation and cutoff, but in fact, not necessarily across the board. Here's the really interesting one. This won't affect most of your businesses, but the level of transparency enforced required fee-based service rather than commission-based service. You're like not even close to where some of the extremities of some of these other legislative environments. But what happened is when people had to start demanding a fee for service, they got really good at adding value. Does that make sense? And it wasn't that they added value and then they charged for it. Is they charged for it and then they worked out they had to add value. And the value followed the price, which is actually quite inspiring if you think about it. It's exciting as a concept. And then fifth, and you already know this is happening, you're going to seek increased consolidation both in your part of the channel but also across the market. That's ultimately what happened. Guess what? They're all still there. They look very different than they looked then, and they act differently, and they have new processes, but some of them are making extraordinary amounts of money in the new reality. Ultimately because of what we call the self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, really quickly, this example is going to feel quite light and fluffy. This is for two reasons. Number one, I just took them through some of the most dense material they're going to have for the whole conference, let alone a keynote, and I want to bring the energy back up, right? Number two is I'm talking about the self-fulfilling prophecy. It's quite a nuanced and abstract idea, and so I almost want to back them in without them even noticing to the realization that their beliefs are being manifested in their reality as well. And so it's light to bring the energy up, and it's light to gently make a very sort of direct observation about them in their lives that almost feels disguised in a way. The University of Buffalo did a fascinating study. It wasn't of business, it was of marriages, actually. Who in the room is married, has a long-term partner, someone they've been with for more than 3 months? Okay. Hey, I lived in LA at one point in my life. This is a big deal. Now, the University of Buffalo have been studying you for 25 years, trying to see if there's one thing that if you've got this one thing, you've got an unbelievable relationship. That one thing mattered more than everything else. What do you think it turned out to be, by the way? Now, I know you personally really want to know the answer to this question. So do they, by the way. Look, 95% of the room are married. Everyone's had a long-term relationship. So I've chosen a topic that everyone's going to be attached to. And now I'm forcing them to yell out and get involved. The interaction, not just the story, is part of how we bring the energy back up. Honesty, trust, respect, communication, compromise. Yeah, you're married. Whoever said that, yeah. Separate seats, did you say? Yeah. Separate seats, separate beds, maybe. I don't know. What about loving them? None of you thought of that. Overrated. Liking them turns out to be overrated as well, actually. Turned out that none of the single characteristics was consistent across the entire... They did this for 25 years, by the way. But the relationship between the characteristics was the causal factor. Here is what they found. If in your partnership, in your marriage, you rated your spouse higher on trust, respect, compromise, love, all the things that you said matter, if you rated them anonymously higher than he or she rated themselves, and vice versa, you had an unbelievably high quality marriage relationship. Let me put it to you differently. The quality of your marriage is directly proportionate to how deluded you are about how good they are. They call that in sociology a self-fulfilling prophecy. In medicine, by the way, we see exactly the same thing. We call it a placebo effect. Did you know the single most repeated, proven concept in all of scientific history is the placebo effect. Nothing has been proven more often and more consistently than the fact that the mind has an ability to control physiology. If you can control physiology, do you think having the appropriate mindset about change and an orientation of positivity towards it could manifest itself in a set of behaviors that creates a good outcome merely because you were looking for a good outcome? Or to put it in the simplest terms possible, change is neither good nor bad. It is whatever you decide it will be. And I've just downloaded empirical, anecdotal, and perfectly parallel evidence from industries just like yours in other parts of the world going through just the same changes where that exact reality has played out. So I would challenge you after today, 1, to get rid of this negative narrative around it. 2, see it for what it really is in the essence of it, and use it as a catalyst to drive efficiency, automation, and increase the value you're able to create in the marketplace. Because if you do those 3 things, guess what? You'll behave in ways that generate those outcomes, creating confirmation bias that it was the right thing in the first place, and then you begin this upward spiral of innovation and margin creation, by the way, as well. Third and final idea on assumptions, because I want to move on and do the other 3 before we get done. But the third and final idea is, in order to do this, sometimes you just got to get out of your own way. Does anyone know who that is? That's quite a famous photo, by the way. It's a guy called Dr. Devi Shetty. Dr. Devi Shetty is a heart surgeon. Does anyone want to take a wild guess how, by the way, there's 2 million heart surgeries conducted in America in any given year, 1.3 million angioplasties, another 650, 700,000 grafts. By the way, 93% of Americans don't change their behavior post-surgery, even though the likely impact of that is death, for the record. And every time we conduct one of those surgeries, the Medicare rebate is $50,000 minimum. The average cost of the total surgery with on-costs and ICU and everything is actually closer to $250 in some parts of America. But let's just use our $50,000 number. Dr. Devi Shetty is famous because he can do that surgery for you for $2,000. Sounds like competitive advantage, wouldn't you agree? Yeah, but when was the last time you went coupon hunting for heart surgery, right? Like, you don't show up with a discount code usually and go, hey, I shopped you around. Like, it's just not how we don't care about price, we care about quality because the stakes are so high. Well, it turns out the average American hospital loses 1.9% of patients after 30 days of these kind of surgeries due to complications, infections, etc. This guy, who operates in Bangalore, India, and I cite that not because there's anything wrong with Bangalore. I love India. It's an amazing place. But it's not where my mind immediately goes for a hygienic healthcare experience. Does that make sense, right? And yet he has lower infection rates and improved survival rates within 30 days, 1.3% at Shetty's hospital in Bangalore. 1.9 in America, 1.3. So his quality of outcome is higher. Hang on, this is healthcare. We need to make money from healthcare. The average American hospital, prior to the Affordable Care Act, made 6.9% return on hospital capital. Now they make about 0, by the way. But let's go with a 6.9. Dr. Devi Shetty makes 7.7% return on hospital capital. The Cleveland Clinic does 1,350 of these a year. He does 3,500. Him and his team do 3,500. So he does 3 times as many almost as the clinic. For 1/25 of the cost, gets a better outcome, and he makes more money. Do you think there's something interesting going on here that we should explore, right? His answer is simply the Ford production line. He says, quote, it's not rocket science we're talking about, it's just hearts. He says, we roll them in, we draw the line, we cut them open, we put the stent in, we don't leave a sponge, we stitch them up and we send them off. Next. It's a production line. Now you think about how uncomfortable that makes you feel. Because you've been conditioned to believe it's all art and it needs a rock star to do it. And he's like, no, it needs a beautiful, replicable process to do it. I remember a journalist interviewing Devi Shetty, and she's like, why don't all surgeons do this? Why doesn't every OR run like this? And he said, they do. Every OR has a division of labor and a production line. And she's like, yeah, but nothing like what you're doing. He's like, no, nothing like what we're doing. And she said, why? And she pestered him and pestered him and pestered him and pestered him. And finally said, all right, his joke, not mine. He says to the journalist, what's the difference between God and a heart surgeon? And the journalist's like, I don't know. Shetty says, God doesn't think she's a heart surgeon. Just sit with that with a second. You'll catch up. You'll get the rest, right? He said, by definition, to be a surgeon, you have to feel like you have some level, they call it the God complex in medicine, right? And he said, the problem is the level of ego that comes with it forces an individual to hold on to too much of the process and become attached, listen to this carefully, become attached to his or her role in that process. So much so that they create inefficiency. He went on to say, where there is ego, there is excess. Where there is unnecessary attachment, there's inefficiency. And in my experience, in professional service environments, like what you and I do for a living, there is a great deal of attachment to what we do and how we do it. It's not necessarily ego, by the way, but it's attachment. We like the lifestyle elements of how we do what we do. We've grown up. In fact, we were sold this thing. If you do 10, 20 years of hard work, you'll ride the annuity into the sunset. And then out of nowhere, boom, we get hit by this freight train of change. And we feel like we've got dealt a bad hand. 3 responses: lay in the corner and suck your thumb, be passive aggressive, or do something about it. A couple of things really quickly. Number one is this concept of identity is a really important idea for this group. They've spent 20, 30 years of their life building their book value on the promise of one day all this will be yours, essentially. And now the legislation and the technological change is pulling the rug out from under them in a way. And so I'm trying to acknowledge that, but also give them a bit of tough love and go, you get to choose how you respond. So again, nesting that loop back. So you've got 3 choices of how you respond. But the second thing, and maybe more importantly, is we're about 45 minutes in to this presentation at this point. It's only a 60-minute keynote. And I have spent 45 minutes on psychology. I spent 45 minutes on beliefs. I spent 45 minutes on assumptions. You know why? Because that's the number one barrier an audience like this that's successful and established and independent faces when it comes to their response to change and disruption. They don't need 84 tactics. They don't need 72 steps. That stuff's easy to find. That's easy to get access to that insight. It's having a catalytic experience that changes the way they see the world, which is the primary role of a keynote, number one. And number two, that's my brief. My brief from my client is, can you change the way they think about the change? And can you change the way they think about responding proactively and doing something about it? And I know their biggest barrier is beliefs and assumptions and identity and attachment. Some of them are running around with this narrative that the world's dealt them a tough deal because of this legislation under some delusion that a change of government will change their world. No, the whole earth has gone in this direction. And so I'm playing at that level and I'm giving it that much time because it's the most important value from the keynote and the most important insight for them in their world right now. And then I'm going to unpack quite quickly the last couple of observations related to the 4 steps, even though I'm still only really wrapping up now the first. Don't get attached to the lifestyle elements or to the parts of the process that you're in. Get some elevation, orient around the outcome, look for the positive opportunity, and then begin to make change in alignment with that. But it needs to be more precise. By the way, I included the data in the slide deck. I'll make sure you guys get the slides if you want to track any of that stuff. But this might be the most important thing I say all day. No matter what happens, you have to get really clear on how you intend to win. And I'll tell you why. What is happening right now in the insurance space, both in the personal and it's increasingly the compression and commoditization is creeping into commercial as well. And it's absolutely happening in financial advice with robo-advisors and ETFs and a whole bunch of stuff happening over in this space as well, right? The things that's happening in those 3 core markets, essentially, is 1, predictable, and 2, has happened many, many times before. It's just a maturity process. The problem is the industries are getting, the maturity is accelerating, which makes it hurt. And so if you study industries that have been through exactly the same experience, a very predictable set of events takes place. They start in a place called happy land. Happy land can be described as small firms doing reasonably well that are protected geographically and whose margins are predictable and good for a consistent period of time. That sounds like your business. Would that be a fair statement? Happy land, right? And then out of nowhere, some force of disruption, be it technology, be it legislation, be it changing consumer expectations, member expectations, all 3, by the way, are happening to you at one time, and it disrupts happy land. And 3 models ultimately emerge from the disruption. This has happened in hundreds of industries. You have a volume model that begins to emerge where people compete on price. Let me just do that neater. You have a volume model where price is the competition. You have a niche model where differentiation is it, or you have what's called a services model where breadth is the solution. Let me give examples. Dell, IBM, Apple. See, niche isn't small. Niche is just a really narrowly defined value proposition. And these are the three models that emerge. Either one, you push the volume, where you go, my margins are getting compressed, so I better sell a massive amount of product to amortize the cost of compliance, in your case, across a larger deal flow or a larger velocity of business, right? Or I find a way to add more value, niche, by being multiple standard deviations from average. And I maybe service a really specific group because it's the only way I can develop enough expertise to create multiple standard deviations of additional value. Or three, I move up and I go, you know what, the most valuable thing I own is the relationship I have with my clients. They trust me and they have for a very long time. What else could I sell them? Because even though my net margin on a core product might be going down, if I could sell them 3 products, maybe I could make that margin back up through the breadth and depth in some ways of that relationship. Here's the thing. Anything that sits on the left is about price, and anything that sits over here is about value. Now, I think it's fair to say we know where most of you are going to get to play. It's probably moving up and then slightly to the right. Okay? Let me tell you what most firms do. They stay in the middle. They stay in the middle and they try and compete on price, but they can never outprice the big guys. You can't out-Amazon Amazon. You can't out-Walmart Walmart. They try and differentiate, but then when you say, what's your point of difference? They say, service. It's the relationship. And they give you abstract answers that have no value in the mind of the member at all. Because they're not really differentiated. They're not multiple standard deviations from average. Or when someone asks, they'll sell them a little bit extra, but only if they ask. Make sense? And what happens is the land of the happy land becomes the land of the boiling frog. Do you guys remember that metaphor from the 90s, right? Basically what happens is our margins get squeezed just a little bit every year. And then we get to President's Club or Champions thing and celebrate our success and everyone's sitting around the beer bar all night going, man, do you remember the good old days? That's when you know you're in the land of the boiling frog, is when those conversations start to emerge, right? You've not seen this behavior ever, right? And because what happens is we end up being nothing powerful to anybody. We're not discriminatory. We don't play with a really clear decision of how we win. And I promise you the great companies know exactly how they're going to win. And then they put every single dollar they have and every single time unit they have to invest in amplifying that value proposition. And they're saying, you know what, we're not going to play over there. That's not our space. This is our space. But we know in order to win, we have to be this good. Or they broaden and go, you know what's relationship? 2,000 to 5,000 members on average in the room. Right? That's the breadth. I mean, you guys have thousands of relationships that you could leverage. So get really, really clear how you're going to win. It's not my job from the stage to tell you exactly what you should choose. But I am absolutely going to tell you that you should choose. Don't get caught in the middle. Because it won't hurt a lot in any given year, but when you look back, it'll hurt a great deal. So after I've done a job for a client, this is the reason they say they book me. Because it's real content. Like that model, there's not a person in that audience that doesn't see exactly how those competitive forces are happening. And there is not an industry in the world that maturation process isn't occurring in. So you can't help but be like confronted by the reality of that. 2, it talks directly to their challenge, like directly to the issues they're facing around competition and the choices they get to make. And number 3, I don't let them back down. I put it on them. You need to make a call. You need to choose how you're going to win. Because if you don't, you're going to get stuck in the middle and your margins are going to get squeezed over time. And one day you're going to look back and you're going to be in a lot of pain. And I couldn't do that in the first 5 minutes,
But I'm in like the last 10 right now, so I'm not backing down. I make the joke that I never get invited back after doing stuff like this, but it's actually the very reason I get invited back. And so if you're going to have me come to your conference, it's going to be provocative like that. It's going to be in your face, but in a very substantive way. And I'm going to build my way to that level of provocation. Because I can assure you the rapport in the room at this point is very high, which is why I'm pushing the envelope a little bit with this group.
Third idea is you have to be willing to take risk. Man, I'm going to have to move super quick. Because nothing changes if nothing changes. Let me give you a super quick example of this, and then I'll give you one point on collaboration, then I'll set you free. Does anyone know what this environment is? Anyone ever seen this retail environment? This is quite famous now as well. It's the Burberry flagship store on Regent Street in London. Been there a couple of times, extraordinary environment. Let me remind you what happened. Angela Arendt leaves Donna Karan in New York, gets hired by Burberry, and to reinvent a 140-year-old brand that's going out of business quickly. The Wall Street analysts peppering her when she gets the job. One of them says to her, Angela, who's your biggest competition? They think she's going to say Coach or Louis Vuitton or Gucci. She says, no. The biggest competitor we face is Burberry online. She says it's the fact that you can buy our product for 25% less online than you can buy it for from us, and I'm going to stick to a bricks and mortar strategy, which means doing business with me and coming into my store must be worth at least 25% of the underlying value of the product. Can you see the parallel, by the way, between what she was dealing with and what we're dealing with as intermediaries in the channel? Doing business with me has to have economic value above and beyond the underlying product. She says, my biggest competition is, can I build a store environment worth 25% of the value of what people are prepared to pay for the product? First version of the store had facial recognition cameras out the front on Regent Street. So as you walk down Regent Street, theoretically, they would match your face to your Facebook profile or your Burberry profile, and they would send you a message, hey Pete, just saw you walking down Regent Street, come back, have we got a deal for you? Freaky and weird and thankfully illegal, so that never actually made it in to the store. Some of you are like, whoa. No, but this is what did make it into the store. When you walk into the store, more than 50% of the garments sold by Burberry already have a near-field communications chip embedded in the tag. Not only that, but they have the highest penetration of members on smartphones of any brand in the world. So you walk into that store, if you're a regular, she knows who you are. That sends that information up to the CRM, which sends down to the handheld device of the sales clerk everything you've ever bought from Burberry in your life. If you're in Sao Paulo the week before and you bought an umbrella, they're going to know about it. Turns out that's not particularly useful, though, because they don't want to know what you've bought. They want to know what you're going to buy. So they take that information, and then they also scrape your Twitter feed and your Pinterest feed. And based on everything you've bought in the past, everything you've pinned or tweeted, and what other people like you have done and bought from the current range, they send a set of recommendations to the people serving you of what products in this year's range that you're most likely to like. They go one step further. There's no point making recommendations they don't have in stock. They take the CRM recommendations and they cross-reference them to the ERP system. And they only recommend things that they have in store or could have at your front door within 24 hours. They go one step further. See that massive screen? In the middle, it plays catwalk footage. But they change the catwalk footage in the store in real time based on the cumulative buying history of everyone who's in there and the current weather in London. And they go one step further. You'll see those blue screens all around the top floor. There's 100 mirrors inside of this store that also double up as flat screen, high definition televisions. And they change and they come on and off and they interact. And if you take a garment off this hanger, it activates the screen closest and shows you the artisan making the garment. Because if you're going to spend $2,500 on a raincoat, you better have a really good story to justify that purchase, right? And then the next screen closest to it says, by the way, this scarf and this bag looks beautiful with that jacket. And they've created the most interesting blended commercial environment in the world. And here is the real critical thing. Two things. Number one, when everyone else was running around trying to take the offline model and put it online, she says, no. That's the wrong assumption. That's taking the conditioned belief, being good with a hammer, and trying to force it into a new world. She says the reason we're losing to online is something is happening online that's not happening in stores right now. What we should be doing is taking online and bringing it into our blended bricks and mortar experience. I want you to think about that. It's about taking the very disruptive force itself and bringing it into the current thing. Now, FYI, 300,000 hours went into building that store. There is no way Burberry could ever afford to do that in every single store in a million years, and I've been there half a dozen times and it only works about a third of the time. And the reason I say that and give you the honest truth about it is because it's not about perfecting the future model. What Burberry were trying to do was lean into the disruption that they faced and learn what the future would look like. And the single biggest takeout they've had from that store is that customers don't like to be treated like they're in a group. They like to be treated as though they're a segment of one. And you're seeing this, by the way, in insurance right now in a big way, this kind of use of telematics and the ability for us to segment and create risks at the level of the individual. Well, people are going to want that in their experience as well. And what Burberry have gone on to do is build the most powerful CRM engine in luxury goods. And it was inspired by this risk they took by moving into the very thing that disrupted them the most.
Okay, so on first glance, using an iconic apparel brand like Burberry in a financial services setting might seem like a crazy idea, but in fact, there are three really specific reasons for it. Number one, the case itself makes the point about taking intelligent risks, and it's one of the most critical steps in leading through transformation is compartmentalizing and taking smart risks. So it makes the point. But it makes two really important subliminal points as well. The average agent in the room has somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 members, clients, customers, and they currently sell basically one product per each of those customers because they don't do anything to develop their relationships. And my client's goal is for them to sell 2 or 3 products per relationship and to develop CRM muscle and CRM capability to do it. So I'm subliminally pushing the corporate strategy at the same time. And number 2, financial services being overcome by technology and this concept of a blended delivery system, the concept of an omni-channel experience is critical as well. So I'm lending credibility to the role technology can play in relationship management. So I'm making the point about intelligent risks, I'm subliminally reinforcing the corporate strategy and the ask of the agency population, and I'm creating a third-party reference for the importance of technology use in managing those relationships. Way more thinking goes into that than, hey, Burberry's a sexy example.
And the only things that Angela and the team there, Angela's actually now moved to Apple, but the only thing that the remaining team at Burberry will do is they'll take the bits from that experiment that worked and they'll scale them. Does that make sense? They didn't make a massive bet on every store in the entire world. They picked one environment and tested it. And I think we could do the same. What if you were to take 100 customers, 100 members, and just test how successful you could be at broadening your product line, your solution set for that segment, and then learn on those 100 before you roll it out to the 2,000? What if you were to pick just one 90-day stretch where every new prospect that came in the door, you attempted to broaden their need state so you could play a deeper and broader role in their lives? What if you were to do that? And just try it. You're not betting the whole business. You're just leaning into that opportunity just a little bit and you're learning there. And then only when you know what works do you begin to scale. So let me sum up and then I'm going to give you the final point in the last 3 minutes. Number 1, what you are facing is not new. Every industry is being disrupted in some way, shape, or form. When you study those who get disrupted and do well in the face of disruption, you learn that the fundamental difference between good decisions and bad decisions are the assumptions that we bring into the future world. You cannot take your conditioned views from the past and shoehorn them into the future. You have to orient around the outcome, not the input, and let go of your personal attachment and bias in that process. 2, you get really, really clear on what your value proposition will be and how you're going to win, and then you align behind that, spending every dollar, every unit of time that is discretionary on that point of difference. 3, you then begin to take risks as you reinvent the model of the future. You lean into these periphery changes, these disruptions that sit around you, not because they're going to work, but because over time, the faster you move, the more you'll learn how to make them work. That risk-taking, that original entrepreneurial behavior that made all of you as successful as you are. And then the 4th and final thing you need to do, and it's no different to what was said in the earlier remarks, is that transformation will not happen in isolation. It will happen in collaboration. Let me wrap where I started.
Now, you might be asking the question, why did he just wrap and he's got an example to go? He hasn't even made the 4th and final point. 2 really specific reasons. 1, sometimes my sessions can be a little bit like drinking out of a fire hose, so wrapping them together and tying a bow around it is critical. I don't do it last because it's intense. I want to take them out on a high. I want it to be a really provocative but interesting and engaging end. And I also know that the CEO's vision is to have one, insert company name here if you remember my remarks from earlier, right? And so I want to end on a high, and I want to end on a topic that's really connected to the organization and its vision. So I wrap now so I can take them out in that direction.
When we did that study for News Corporation, we studied lots of successful companies and lots of unsuccessful companies. The one company that gave us the most consternation of missing the biggest market opportunity that was right in front of them was Sony. I want you to think 15 years ago. I'll do this really quickly. 15 years ago, when Sony was sort of sitting on what you could argue was a gold mine. I mean, they had every possible asset you could ever need to compete in the world. They owned the technology, right? I mean, they were synonymous with miniature sound. Like when the iPod hit, no one was better positioned to ride that trend than Sony. They not only had the technology, but they also had the distribution. They could get into any store anywhere in the world within 48 hours and could have blanketed the world with MP3 players and whatever they wanted. They had a third thing, which was brand. They were synonymous with the category. If you had bought a competitor to the Walkman, you still would have called it a Walkman. Do you remember? Like what Kleenex is to tissues, they were to digital music. To portable music. They owned two more assets. What were they? Music, and then video. I want you to imagine you own the technology. I want you to imagine you've got the most enviable distribution platform in the whole marketplace. I want you to imagine that you have a brand that's synonymous with the category. And then I want you to imagine you have the content that goes on the device. And now I want you to imagine you missed the biggest market opportunity in 50 years. I have lost sleep trying to understand how that happened. I think someone should go to jail for that, by the way. No, you steal a car, you go to jail, you destroy billions of dollars. Did you know their market value is down 55% since that day? Apple's up 7,090%. Clearly, I was really long in Sony stock, and I haven't quite gotten over that experience yet, and I'm carrying it with me into the new millennium. But really quickly, I've read every case study, I've read every book, I've even worked there to try and figure out can't get an answer. And then one day, I meet the former chairman of Sony Pictures. I'm in a green room waiting to go up on stage, and I hear him speak. I'm like, that's him. I used to hear him on Wall Street briefings because I went back and listened to those as well to see if I could find a clue. And I'm like, this is my chance. Be polite, be polite, be polite. Dude, were you asleep at the wheel? Do you know how much money you cost me? Grandmas can't retire because of you. All over this guy. I mean, he was not impressed. He gets up, he storms out, he walks out on stage. There's 7,000 people in the room. He says to the audience, you won't believe what just happened to me. The waiter out the back just asked me how Sony missed the biggest market opportunity in 50 years. And I figured if he wanted to know, a bunch of smart people like you probably want to know as well. He said, quote, and I'm finishing here, he said, quote, do you not believe anything you've read, anything you've ever seen? Anyone who's making up a story about how we missed the biggest opportunity in 50 years, it's wrong. He says, I was there. We all knew where it was going. Everyone knew what the market was going to do. He said, we missed it not because we couldn't see it. We missed it because nobody at Sony talked to each other anymore. He said, the more disrupted a market becomes, the more the opportunities are actually found in the white space between players in a value chain. He said, what we own the whole value chain, needed to get right was the collaboration that sat through the middle. And one of the most powerful things about the channel you're in and the relationship you have is that you're not on your own. The better you leverage each other and the better you leverage this whole value chain, the easier you're going to find to navigate this transformation. Do not go it alone. You don't need to, and you won't make it if you do. So from me to you, have a rockin' time in Montreal. Thank you for the invitation. Take care, guys. I'll see you next time.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the process of unpacking that experience. I've got to be honest, it's going to look different for your audience. The 300 pages we pull together to understand your world will define the structure and will define the case studies. But hopefully you're getting a good sense of the balance between content, insight, observation, and the energetic experience itself, which at times is funny, but at other times is very provocative and quite in your face. But really, that's the goal of a keynote, If you're going to invest the money to bring someone like me in, you want to change their world. You want to create a catalytic experience that shifts the way they respond and changes the way they act. And that's what an experience like that's designed to do. Be happy to partner with you for you and your event. Just reach out and let us know how we can help. Thanks for taking the time.